Thank you, Tanabe-san, and thank you, Dr. Zettelmeyer, for your excellent presentation. Uh, as you have admitted it at the outset of your presentation, your presentation more or less focused on the domestic aspect of the challenges EU face to the new global the commercial the settings. So therefore, maybe I would like to express my personal take on your presentation and particularly try to lead to some discussion on the international dimension of the kind of a point made by your presentation. Uh, I guess out of the lots of points made by you, as far as I'm concerned, the most important point I should highlight is a question you were asking in the form of how to minimize the trade-off of the three elements: growth efficiency, number two, decarbonization, and economic security. How to minimize the trade-off amongst three is one of the important questions you have posed in your presentation, which is quite valid. And and also in order for you to at least minimize this trade-off, you have suggested some changes or modification of the currently emerging response out of European Union to these new challenges. I am not in the position of making any comments on this alternative per se. However, I would like to make some points on your suggestion. One of which is that I also admit that we have to be careful about the distinction between the concept of economic security and economic nationalism. Economic nationalism is obviously in the trade measure, the form of the trade measure, which is kind of intended to give the interest for their own domestic, maybe vested interest under the sacrifice of other countries' interest. So in this sense, it's a kind of the spirit is purely inward looking. On the other hand, the economic security concept is not. Economic security is more or less, I mean, security is a kind of concept which will be realized by kind of alliance with like-minded countries. So therefore, by nature, economic security concept is not going to be the inward-looking concept. So therefore, it's relatively not really difficult for us to distinguish between these two concepts on condition that we successfully make a kind of a clear line to draw between these two, which is kind of challenging. And in order for us to do that, of course, you suggested in your presentation that economic security needs to be better defined. Generally speaking, it is true and it is correct. However, how to do that is kind of difficult question, which has to do with my suggestion, which is that we have to establish legal regime, not just a cooperative relationship, but also we have to have a legal regime backed up by the reasonably strong dispute settlement mechanism, which will allow us to accumulate enriched jurisprudence to give us idea what is the concept on the text. So as without that, we'll not be able to have any idea where the line to draw. So therefore, in order for us to minimize the trade-off amongst these three, the growth efficiency, decarbonization, economic security, one of the most important ingredients is to have a stronger legal regime backed up by dispute settlement mechanism. Having a dispute settlement mechanism and a strong legal regime internationally has another bonus, which is to give predictability to our potential partner which needs further predictability. Japan, European Union, United States are bigger enough not to be which may not need too much on the predictability international commerce environment. But our potential partner, which are smaller players, need that. So in order for us to garner support for our alliance on economic security, we need a legal regime which give a legal predictability to these relatively smaller players. Without that, our alliance is not going to see any further expansion. And also by having that alliance or expansion, which go over to the smaller players, we'll be able to achieve the mutual dependence and mutual complementary, and also which will strengthen economic security. Therefore, again, I would like to repeat the importance of having legal regime, based on the idea of the rule of law. And one more thing, in order for us to do that, the first thing we have to do between European Union and Japan is to think about how to get the United States back to our side. Building upon the alliance amongst these triangle, you have a good relationship with the United States, and Japan has a good relationship with United States. The EU and Japan has a good bilateral relationship. And seemingly, at least it used to be that the US and the European Union did not see a good relationship enough. Looking at your reaction to the IRA, for instance, this is very typical kind of example of the thorny relationship between the kind of EU and the European Union. But on the other hand, I recently noticed a very important news, which is that the European Union and the United States agreed upon the US data protection adequacy of the data privacy framework, which has been kind of very, very difficult issue transatlantic. Since this issue has been sorted out somehow transatlantic, I see that there seems to be some sign of improvement of your relationship with the United States, building upon which we may be able to cooperate together to get the United States back, to construct the legal regime among three. And based upon that, we may be able to reach out to the kind of smaller players. So this is kind of my suggestion. I have been strong advocate of the alliance of CPTPP and the European Union. I'm not urging you to join the CPTPP, but I would like to suggest that the EU should consider the opening up a dialogue on the alliance with the CPTPP, so that both of us will be able to make the best effort to get the US back to the legal regime. Then we'll be able to have a meaningful friend-shoring regime. Particularly, EU is very famous for its strengths in the smart regulatory strategy, and the EU and Japan has EPA. The EU-Japan EPA, it has a lot of elements, but one of the most important elements is regulatory cooperation, because this is a good reflection of EU strengths in the regulatory strategy. So Japan and the EU, we don't have money, so therefore we have a power to regulate. So by having a smart regulation, we'll be able to have a better kind of regime, so that we'll be able to encourage the private investment for the greener and more modernized supply chain. Then eventually we'll be able to urge US to get back to the kind of legal alliance, which I eventually hope that the long term will lead to the reform of WTO, but not in short term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tamura-san. Zettelmeyer-san, any response to Tamura-san?
Yeah, so I agree with almost everything you said. I probably should have emphasized the trade aspects more in my presentation. Just maybe some additional thoughts on this. So, I think we agree. I think, you know, the EU and Japan are more closely aligned, right, on this issue than either the EU with the US or Japan with the US. The question is what type of international or trade policy cooperation to push for with the United States. And so, you know, in principle, there's the multilateral route, WTO. And I mean, I do agree that the WTO, although I would view it as mostly a protection against economic nationalism, not so much on economic security, because, you know, when it comes to security, of course, the WTO has a general national security exemption, and it also will be difficult, I think, to constrain any member of the WTO of, you know, undertaking aggressive action because of a WTO prohibition. So, you know, here, however, it is still important because in general, it will help to maintain open trade, and the integration with third countries, so not with the aggressor, but with third countries that follows from that, contributes to economic security. So in that sense, I fully agree. The problem is that as I mean, you know this better because you're a trade policy expert and I'm not. It is a particularly difficult topic to cooperate on with the US, certainly with this administration. Maybe we'll get a chance if the next election results in a, you know, political change in the US that reduces the pressure of a future democratic administration to make concessions to the economic nationalism that is being used by the Trump camp. So we may get another chance, but not in the immediate future. In the meantime, what I'm concerned with is that the approach that the US has been advocating, for example, on steel, is too discriminatory to third countries, including countries that you want to get on board, right? So it has some of the same flavor as the EU CBAM, but the EU CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is, you know, very carefully constructed to be as non-discriminatory as possible. It may still conflict with some WTO rules. I'm not an expert on that, but it's certainly the intention is not to be discriminatory. I think analogous carbon club ideas by the US and, you know, possibly similar ideas with respect to raw materials may be more discriminatory by design. So there is this difficulty, I think, or this trade-off in building trade agreements that are mostly directed against your ally, towards your allies, right? And so are good for economic security in a defensive sense. At least, you know, we and our partners are protected, and to have an approach that gets you friends in the world outside the immediate circle of your direct allies. And, you know, the reactions of non-aligned countries to the invasion of Ukraine have persuaded me that we do need to take this broader approach. There's a little bit of a trade-off there too. You know, I do agree, however, that in general, the Biden administration has been pedaling back on this, right? So, you know, at least to come up with solutions that also are good for your allies is a good start, right? And we can see whether we would want to be even less discriminatory than than that. And so I do agree that, you know, after the initial after allies getting upset about the IRA, the Biden administration has been making sort of serious attempts to pedal back from that, and that we, meaning Japan and the EU, should do everything to help them to do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Zettelmeyer. May I go on the questions and answers? Dr. Zettelmeyer, can you see questions in the chat box?
Yes.
There are many questions coming. And say Q1, question 1 is asking how EU is seeing Japan as a partner in comparison with China and the US. I think you have already responded, but you have
yes, I mean, I think, I mean, it is, I would say that, you know, no one at the EU level views China as being a better partner than Japan, right? I mean, China is viewed as a threat and Japan is an ally. However, I do think that there is an underappreciation of the fact that Japan and the EU are more closely aligned with each other than with the US, and that we should do more with this. So that I fully agree with that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zettelmeyer. That's what I wanted to hear as EUJapan Center for Industrial Cooperation. Thank you. Let's go on Q2. Can you see? Isn't economic international?
Yes, I can see the isn't economic internationalism as vulnerable to the influence of special interests as economic nationalism? So, of course, all firms like to lobby, and if firms are internationally integrated, they will lobby to keep integration going, right? So in that sense, you know, there is any policy is subject to special interests. But what I meant by this is that there is something particularly inviting to special interests from economic nationalism, because economic nationalism is specifically about support to domestic firms and you know, keeping your competitors from other countries at bay, right? So that is particularly inviting. So I would say, as a concept, economic nationalism is something that many domestic firms, except for multinationals and highly export-oriented firms that feel strong, will like, right? So that's how I meant this.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I go on? Question number 3 is about industrial policy. Japan is discussing new strategy for industrial policy. Do you have any foreign industrial policies outside the EU that you rate highly? Are you aware with industrial policies outside EU?
So, I mean, the general perception, I think, is that Japan, in particularly, and East Asian countries more generally, have been rather more successful with industrial policies than countries in Latin America or even in Europe, right? So industrial policy in France, certainly in the 1960s and 70s, is widely considered a failure. The question, though, is that the success of industrial policies in Japan and other bits of East Asia was mostly during the catch-up phase, right? So Japan moved away from economic nationalism in the 70s. And what is unclear to me is how, you know, there is a very active debate on how to do best industrial policy in advanced countries. I'm not familiar enough with what Japan is trying to say, whether it's a model or not. But I think there is a way of doing good industrial policy in advanced countries. I'm not against it. I would prefer to do it in a non-discriminatory way because of all the trade-offs that are involved. I think there are, you know, some approaches are better than others. We have used the ARPA-DARPA example as a successful one. There could be similar success stories in Japan, and thank you for reminding me to look at those.
Thank you very much. Maybe what Japan is doing, trying to do, can be elaborated by, say, METI or Prime Minister Kishida or METI or RIETI. So let's go further discussion on this point. Go on to question number 4.
Yes, so this is
autonomous driving AI.
Yeah, so this, I basically here, I agree with the idea that in industrial countries with high levels of regulation and social protection, it may be too difficult to innovate in areas that involve taking risks, right? So I think that we should make it easier to experiment in these areas, regardless of whether we want to have, regardless of whether we think of this as a technology race against the developing countries, or whether we just think of it as, look, let's try and make it easier to innovate in these areas for the benefit of everyone. I think this is correct. And when I was in the German Ministry of Economic Affairs, we actually tried to come up with a concept called regulatory sandboxes, to introduce this concept to create this space, because Germany is particularly obsessive in making everything very safe, right? So the idea of having autonomous vehicles drive around by themselves and so forth was a kind of a scary idea to the German mind. And we argue that in particular settings, one should make exceptions to this. So I do agree with this.
Okay, good. Let's go question number 5. Technology neutrality and industrial policy, and how can we urge China to introduce your...
Right. So here I would say that in the technology neutrality is, I'm advocating this not because, so basically I think this would be unilaterally good. So I don't think that technology neutrality only works if your competitor is also technology neutral. For me, technology neutrality is just smarter, because you're not pretending like you know what the perfect answer to a technological challenge is already, right? And so I think this should be done regardless of what China is doing. But I think it also requires very strong governance, strong institutions, and we don't have those at the EU level. You do then have them in Japan, of course. I mean, for you, it's easier to have strong technology neutral industrial policy than for us.
Okay, good. Thank you. Then go on to question number 6 about energy security.
Yes. So this is a huge question. This is one of the questions that worries us most. And in fact, we are seeing currently a political backlash against decarbonization. We are very worried that the elections for the European Parliament will be dominated by this issue, so that there will be an increasingly view both on the right and on the left of the spectrum that we cannot afford fast decarbonization, either for social reasons, because it hurts the weaker in society, or because it puts us at a competitive disadvantage and hurts industry, right? So we are seeing those noises everywhere in the EU. So this is very concerning. There is, in principle, a solution, of course, to, more aggressively develop technology and increase energy supply that is both climate friendly and will reduce energy prices. The problem with this approach is that first, it will take some time. So particularly, some parts of German industries are incredibly keen on green hydrogen because they think that this will make it easier to essentially keep our current model based on cheap energy imports. And many politicians also favor this because the alternative to this approach would be to try and import energy-intensive goods to a greater extent. So to essentially shift parts of the value chain and hence also some jobs outside the EU into areas of the world that just have cheaper energy, right? You have exactly the same problem in Japan, I think. So this is an active debate. The other problem with this approach that, let's just aggressively push renewables and green hydrogen, and this will get rid of this trade-off, is that it requires financing. So it's fiscally expensive. And we don't have this financing at the EU level. And so my view is that the trade-off between decarbonization, speed, and acceptability of energy cost could be solved, but it would require a stronger funding push at the EU level. So we cannot have all three things. We're going to have to choose.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Zettelmeyer and Tamura-san, for very, very interesting, stimulative discussion on your thinking. Sorry for the extension of the session time. So I'd like to adjourn this special seminar. So thank you very much, Dr. Zettelmeyer, Tamura-san. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanabe-san. I apologize for speaking too long.
No problem.
And thank you, Tamura-san, for your remarks.
Thank you very much.